March 19th, 1943. Three German soldiers stood on the deck of a British transport ship gripping the cold metal railing as Atlantic wind cut through their threadbare uniforms. The shaking in their hands had nothing to do with temperature. They were shaking because they believed they had only hours to live. Their names were Wilhelm Bauer, Martin Schmidt, and Karl Zimmermann. And their story began not with their capture, but with a lie so thoroughly believed it had become indistinguishable from truth. Wilhelm was 36 years old, a school teacher from Cologne who had taught mathematics and German literature to children who still believed the world was a good place. In 1939, when the war began, he joined the Wehrmacht because that was what educated men did, what patriots did, what the Führer expected. He had never wanted to be a soldier, had never fired a weapon in anger. But the army needed officers, and teachers made good officers because they understood instruction and discipline. So Wilhelm became Hauptmann Bauers, assigned to a tank unit that was sent to North Africa to fight alongside Rommel's Afrika Korps. In March of 1943, his tank ran out of fuel in the Tunisian desert during a British advance. They also ran out of ammunition. When Allied soldiers surrounded the position, Wilhelm had faced a choice order: his men to fight with their bare hands or surrender and live. He chose life, chose captivity, chose shame, because that was what surrender meant in the ideology he had been taught. Not pragmatism, not survival, just shame and dishonor and the certainty that terrible things awaited those who lacked the courage to die fighting. Martin was 23 years old, the youngest son of a factory worker from Essen. He had grown up poor in an industrial city where the sky was always gray with coal smoke and opportunities were scarce. The army had seemed like a way out, a chance to see the world, a chance to be part of something larger than the grinding poverty of his youth. He was a mechanic, good with engines and machines. The Wehrmacht assigned him to a supply unit maintaining trucks and vehicles. He had never wanted to fight, had never believed the propaganda about racial superiority or living space or the Jewish conspiracy. He just wanted to fix engines and maybe save enough money to open his own shop someday. But in Tunisia, British tanks overran his convoy. He was loading supplies onto a truck when bullets started flying. His sergeant ordered everyone to raise their hands. Martin did what he was told. And as British soldiers approached with rifles pointed at his chest, every propaganda poster he had ever seen flashed through his mind. The posters that showed Allied soldiers as monsters, as sadists who tortured prisoners, as barbarians who would work captured Germans to death in slave labor camps. Martin had dismissed much of the propaganda as exaggeration. But in that moment, staring at foreign soldiers speaking a language he did not understand, doubt crept in. What if the posters were right? What if he was about to experience horrors he could not imagine? Karl was 30 years old, a farmer from a small village in East Prussia, so far east it was practically Russia. He had a wife named Anna and two young daughters. He did not want to be a soldier, did not care about Hitler's vision for Germany, just wanted to work his land, raise his family, live in peace. But the government did not ask. They conscripted him, sent him first to the Eastern Front, where he saw things that gave him nightmares. Watched friends die in the snow, watched Russian villages burn, watched the war strip away everything human and replace it with survival instinct and numbness. Then they transferred him to Italy, a punishment maybe, or just the random chaos of military bureaucracy. When Canadian soldiers captured his unit in Sicily, Karl felt something unexpected. Not just fear, but relief. The killing would stop, at least for him, at least for now. But relief was quickly replaced by dread, because every soldier in the German army had heard the stories, had been told repeatedly what happened to prisoners of war in Allied hands. The beatings, the starvation, the casual cruelty, and most terrifying of all, the executions. There was one story that had spread through the Wehrmacht like a virus, a rumor that had the weight of truth because it was repeated so often in so many variations by so many seemingly credible sources. In Canada, they said condemned prisoners received one final meal before execution, usually something simple, often just boiled potatoes. Wilhelm remembered exactly where he had heard this story. In a canteen in Tripoli months before his capture, an older Oberst had been holding court telling younger officers about Allied barbarity. The Oberst claimed to have inside information from intelligence sources, claimed that captured German officers were routinely executed after show trials, claimed that the last thing they saw was a plate of boiled potatoes, a final mockery before death. The story had seemed absurd at the time, but now standing on the deck of a ship headed toward an unknown destination, Wilhelm found himself believing it. Because what else could he believe? He had surrendered, had chosen captivity over death, and according to everything he had been taught, that choice had consequences. The capture itself had been almost anticlimactic. British soldiers shouting in English, Wilhelm raising his hands, his crew following his lead, a quick search for weapons. Then sitting in the desert sand, hands on heads, while more prisoners were gathered from other destroyed positions. He had expected immediate violence, expected rifle butts to the face, expected to be beaten or shot or humiliated. Instead, a British sergeant offered him water from a canteen. Real water, not poisoned, not withheld, just water freely given to an enemy who had been trying to kill British soldiers hours earlier. The contradiction was unsettling. Propaganda said the British were ruthless, yet here was a sergeant showing basic human decency. Wilhelm did not know what to make of it, so he filed it away. One data point that did not fit the narrative he had been given. Martin's capture had been more chaotic. Bullets everywhere, shouting in multiple languages. The smell of cordite and burning rubber. He had thrown himself to the ground when the shooting started, hands over his head, waiting for death. When silence finally came, he looked up to see British soldiers moving through the wreckage. They were young. Some looked barely 18. They searched the German prisoners efficiently, but not brutally, took weapons, checked for injuries, organized everyone into groups for transport. One soldier, a corporal with a Scottish accent, helped Martin to his feet. "You hurt, mate?" the corporal asked in broken German. Martin shook his head, could not speak, could not process the kindness in the question. "Good," the corporal said. "Stay with your group. No running, no trouble. You'll be processed soon." Processed. That word carried ominous weight. Martin had heard stories about processing, about camps where prisoners were sorted, where the strong were worked to death, where the weak were simply eliminated. He had heard these stories from other soldiers, from propaganda broadcasts, from officers who claimed to know the truth. Karl's capture had been the quietest. Canadian soldiers surrounded his position on a hillside in Sicily. His commanding officer, a young lieutenant who looked even more terrified than Karl, ordered everyone to surrender. They laid down their weapons, walked down the hill with hands raised, and waited for whatever came next. A Canadian officer spoke to them in accented German, explained they were now prisoners of war, that they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, that they would be safe as long as they followed orders. Geneva Convention. Karl had heard the term before, but did not really understand what it meant. Some kind of international law about war, some kind of rules that were supposed to protect prisoners. But Karl had seen what happened when rules were broken, had seen atrocities on the Eastern Front, had learned that laws meant nothing when men with guns decided to ignore them. So he nodded when the Canadian officer spoke, but he did not believe. He prepared himself mentally for suffering, for death, for the inevitable cruelty that must come when you were powerless in the hands of enemies. The journey to the transport ship took 3 days, by truck through dusty Tunisian landscapes, then waiting in a temporary holding facility near the port of Algiers. The conditions were basic but not brutal. Food was provided, water was available, medical staff treated injuries. Wilhelm observed everything with the analytical mind of a teacher, looking for patterns, trying to understand what was really happening beneath the surface. The treatment seemed adequate, not generous, not kind, but adequate, meeting basic human needs without excess. This confused him, because propaganda had promised deliberate cruelty, starvation rations, casual violence, the breaking of men's spirits through systematic dehumanization. But what he experienced was bureaucratic efficiency, processing, organization. The machinery of a military system managing captured enemies according to established protocols. When they were finally loaded onto the British transport ship, Wilhelm expected the facade to drop, expected to be chained in the hold, packed together in darkness, left to suffer in filth and fear. That was what happened to animals being transported to slaughter. That was what he had been told would happen to captured Germans. But the reality was different. They had sleeping quarters below deck. Cramped, yes, but with bunks. with mattresses, with blankets, with portholes that let in light and air. Wilhelm climbed onto his assigned bunk and stared at the ceiling, trying to reconcile expectation with reality. The first meal on the ship arrived on metal trays. Martin looked down at his portion and felt his heart begin to race. Bread, real bread with actual substance, canned meat that smelled edible, vegetable soup, an apple. He could not remember the last time he had seen fresh fruit. In North Africa, rations had been minimal. Hardtack, tinned goods, whatever could be scrounged from the desert. And before that in Germany, civilians were already experiencing shortages. His mother's letters described waiting in bread lines. Rationing that made every meal an exercise in making do with less. Yet here he was, a prisoner, eating better than German civilians. The contradiction made his head hurt. A prisoner in the bunk beside Martin leaned close and whispered, "It's poisoned. They're poisoning us slowly, making us suffer." Martin looked at the food, looked at other prisoners tentatively eating, looked at British guards at their own tables across the mess hall, eating the same food from the same kitchen. The logic did not support poisoning, but fear was not logical. He took a small bite of bread, waited for pain, for sickness, for the poison to take effect. Nothing happened, just the simple satisfaction of food entering an empty stomach. He ate more, slowly, carefully, still waiting for the trick to reveal itself. Wilhelm watched the interactions between prisoners and guards with analytical interest. The guards were not cruel. They maintained discipline but without brutality. They answered questions through interpreters. They provided necessities without commentary or judgment. They treated prisoners like prisoners of war being processed according to regulations. This was not the behavior of monsters. This was the behavior of professional soldiers following orders within a system of laws. And that realization was deeply unsettling. Because if the British were following laws, then maybe the Geneva Convention was real. And if that was real, then what else had been lies? On the 7th day of the Atlantic crossing, something happened that shook Wilhelm's certainty. A British guard was distributing cigarettes, free cigarettes, American Lucky Strikes, and British Players, just handing them out to prisoners. Wilhelm spoke enough English to ask why. The guard shrugged like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Geneva Convention, mate. Your POWs, not animals. Got rights under international law." Geneva Convention, international law, rights. These concepts existed in theory. Wilhelm had heard them discussed in academic contexts, but he had been told they were just propaganda, just allied lies designed to make Germany look barbaric by comparison, just empty words that meant nothing in practice. But this guard spoke about them like they were real, like they were binding obligations that must be followed, like even enemy prisoners deserve certain minimum standards of treatment. The information spread through the prisoners in whispered German. International law, rights, protections. Some men refused to believe it, insisted it was a trick, that the real suffering would begin when they reached land, that these comforts were just psychological warfare designed to break their will. But doubts were forming, small cracks in the wall of certainty, like hairline fractures in ice before it shatters. Wilhelm lay in his bunk that night and tried to sort through his thoughts. If the British were following international law, now why would they stop later? If they were providing adequate food and shelter during transport, why would they suddenly become cruel in Canada? The logic suggested consistency, suggested that maybe possibly the propaganda had been wrong. But accepting that meant accepting something far more difficult, that his own government had lied, that the ideology he had taught to children was built on falsehoods, that everything he believed about the war might be inverted, that the monsters might not be the enemies he was fighting, but the system he was serving. These were dangerous thoughts, treasonous thoughts. Wilhelm pushed them away, focused on immediate survival, on making it through each day without falling apart. The deeper questions could wait until he had more information, until he understood what awaited in Canada. April 15, 1943, the ship docked in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Wilhelm Martin Karl and 842 other German prisoners were transferred to trains heading west. Through windows, they saw a country that should not exist according to everything they had been told. Cities with lights blazing, no blackout curtains, no fear of bombers, just normal life continuing as if war was happening somewhere else, which it was. The war had not touched Canada, had not bombed its cities or destroyed its infrastructure or turned its farmland into battlefields. Factories operated at full capacity. Smoke from chimneys indicating industrial production running day and night. Roads filled with civilian vehicles despite rationing that was supposed to make gasoline unavailable. Farms showing no signs of combat damage. No refugees, no destruction. Just prosperity and peace in normalcy. Martin pressed his face against the cold glass. "This cannot be real," he muttered in German. The propaganda said the Allies were losing, said their economies were collapsing, said their cities were destroyed. But look at this. Outside the window, children played in a schoolyard, just playing, laughing, living normal childhoods, not hiding in bomb shelters, not scrounging for food, not being indoctrinated in Hitler youth camps, just being children. The train carried them to Ontario, to a place called Bowmanville, to Camp 30, a prisoner of war facility that could house 600 men, but would eventually hold over 800 as the war continued. As trucks transported them, the final kilometers from the train station, Wilhelm kept waiting for the real camp to appear. The one from propaganda films. Mud and barbed wire and machine guns and brutality. That was what prisoner camps looked like in the German imagination. That was what had been promised. But Camp 30 looked almost institutional. Brick buildings, organized layout, a recreation hall, a medical building with a Red Cross, sports fields. This looked like a school or a training facility, not a death camp, not a place designed to break men through systematic cruelty. Inside the barracks, each prisoner received a bunk with a mattress and blankets. The building had heating, running water, flush toilets, showers. These were amenities, comforts, things that suggested long-term habitation under humane conditions. Martin stood in the shower room and let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. "I had worse facilities in my apartment in Essen," he said to no one in particular. "I am a prisoner of war, and I have better plumbing than I had as a free man in Germany." The first dinner changed everything. Prisoners lined up in the mess hall. Canadian soldiers served food onto metal trays. Wilhelm held out his tray and watched as portions were added. Boiled potatoes, carrots, a piece of meat, bread with butter. His hands went numb. The tray nearly slipped from his grip. Boiled potatoes. The last meal. The execution meal. The final mercy before death. Around him, realization rippled through the line. Prisoners whispering frantically in German. "Das ist es. Das ist die letzte Mahlzeit." This is it. This is the final meal. Some refused to take their trays. Others grabbed food and began eating desperately, as if dying with a full stomach was somehow better than dying hungry. A few began praying, asking God for forgiveness, preparing for imminent death. Carl sat at a long table, his entire body shaking. He looked at the boiled potatoes on his plate. Simple potatoes with butter melting on top. They looked harmless, ordinary. But according to everything he had heard, they were a death sentence, a message that his time had come, that the execution would happen soon. He thought about Anna, about his daughters, about the farm he would never see again, about the life stolen from him by war and ideology and bad luck. This was the end. And the cruelty was that they fed you first, made you taste life one more time before taking it away. Martin could not pick up his fork. His hands trembled too violently, but Wilhelm was watching something that contradicted the narrative. The Canadian guards were eating. At their own tables across the mess hall, guards sat with identical trays. The same food, boiled potatoes, carrots, meat. They were laughing, talking, eating a normal dinner without any indication that something terrible was about to happen. Wilhelm's mathematical mind engaged despite his fear. If this was truly the last meal before execution, why would the guards be eating the same food? Why would they be so relaxed? Why would they waste meat and fresh vegetables on prisoners they intended to kill? The logic did not support the conclusion. But fear was stronger than logic. And the fear had been carefully cultivated by years of propaganda, by stories repeated until they became truth, by a system that had taught these men that surrender meant death and captivity meant suffering. Wilhelm set down his tray, looked around the mess hall, counted the prisoners, 843 men. If Canada intended to execute them all, where would that happen? How would that happen? Where were the execution facilities? Where was the evidence of systematic killing? There was none. Just a mess hall, just ordinary soldiers serving ordinary food, just the bureaucratic machinery of a military prison processing captured enemies according to established rules. Wilhelm picked up his fork, took a bite of potato. It was warm, buttery, perfectly cooked. It tasted like food, not like death, just food. But around him, hundreds of German prisoners were convinced they were eating their final meal, were preparing themselves for execution, were saying silent farewells to families they would never see again, because they had been lied to so thoroughly that they could not recognize reality when it sat on a metal tray in front of them. That night, Wilhelm lay in his bunk still alive. They all were. No executions, no sudden violence, no revelation of the cruelty that was supposed to come. Just prisoners, sleeping in bunks in a heated barracks, waiting for morning. He stared at the ceiling and felt the first real crack form in his certainty. A small crack, but a crack nonetheless. Because if they were wrong about the boiled potatoes, what else were they wrong about? And if the propaganda about executions was false, how much other propaganda was equally false? These questions haunted him through the night and would continue haunting him through the months to come as reality systematically dismantled everything he thought he knew about the war, the enemy, and the system he had served. The morning after the boiled potato incident, Wilhelm woke to sunlight streaming through barracks windows. He was alive. They all were. No midnight executions, no sudden revelation of cruelty. Just morning in a prisoner of war camp where men were beginning to realize that their expectations did not match reality. Camp life developed a routine. Wake-up call at 6:30, breakfast of porridge bread and sometimes eggs, then work assignments for volunteers. The guards explained through interpreters that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could not be forced to work, but those who chose to work would be paid. 20 cents per day for general labor, 50 cents for skilled work. The money could be used in the camp store to buy soap, cigarettes, chocolate, writing materials. This concept, paying prisoners for labor, seemed almost obscene to men who had been told they would be worked to death without compensation. Yet here were the Canadians offering wages and explaining rights as if international law was something real and binding. Wilhelm volunteered for the library. He was educated, could read and write well, spoke some English. The camp librarian, a Canadian sergeant named Morrison, showed him the collection. Hundreds of books, some in German, many in English, and most importantly, newspapers. Canadian newspapers, American newspapers. Real news not filtered through Goebbels' propaganda machine. "You can read whatever you want," Sergeant Morrison said in careful German. "We don't censor the library. You're adults. You can handle information." Wilhelm picked up a Canadian newspaper. The front page showed maps of the war. The Eastern Front, where Germany was being pushed back by Soviet forces. The Mediterranean, where Allied forces were gaining ground. The Atlantic, where U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could build them. This was not the victorious Germany of propaganda broadcasts. This was a nation losing on every front. Fighting a war it could not win against enemies with superior industrial capacity and unlimited resources. The truth was laid out in black and white, undeniable and devastating. Wilhelm read every newspaper he could find. Each day brought more evidence, more contradictions to everything he had been taught. The wall of certainty was crumbling, and he did not know what to build in its place. Martin volunteered for the vehicle repair shop. He was a mechanic, needed to work with his hands, needed something familiar to anchor himself while everything else felt uncertain. The shop was just outside the camp. A Canadian sergeant named Douglas supervised. Martin walked in and stopped dead. The place was filled with spare parts, shelves of them, bins of bolts and screws, stacks of tires, new engine parts still in factory boxes, tools he had never seen. Everything clean, organized, abundant. Martin picked up a wrench and just held it, felt the weight, the quality. "Where does all this come from?" he asked Douglas in broken English. Douglas looked confused by the question. "Detroit," he said as if explaining something obvious. "Factories. We produce thousands of vehicles every month. need parts to maintain them. Thousands every month. Martin did the mathematics. Germany's entire industrial capacity could not match that production. The Africa Corps had been desperate for supplies, had been told it was because British navies sank supply ships. But now Martin wondered if maybe Germany simply could not produce enough, had never been able to, had been losing the industrial war from the beginning. He worked on Canadian trucks and saw the quality, the engineering, the abundance of replacement parts. And he understood something terrible. Germany had fought a modern war with insufficient industrial base, had relied on ideology and willpower when wars were actually won with production capacity and resources, had believed propaganda about Allied weakness when the reality was overwhelming Allied strength. Karl volunteered to work on local farms. He was a farmer. Missed the land, missed the satisfaction of making things grow. The Guards sent him to a farm 5 kilometers from camp. A Canadian farmer named Thompson needed help with spring planting. What Karl saw there broke something inside him. Thompson had 3 tractors. 3. For one farm. In Karl's village in East Prussia, the entire village shared one tractor among 20 families. And that one tractor broke constantly because there were no parts to repair it. But Thompson acted like having 3 tractors was completely normal. Like abundance was the default state. Like resource scarcity was something foreign and incomprehensible. During lunch break, Thompson's wife brought sandwiches and milk. The children complained about rationing, about having butter only every other day. Karl almost laughed. These people thought every other day butter was hardship. In Germany, most people had not seen real butter in over a year. 8 synthetic substitutes made from coal derivatives that tasted like chemicals. That night, Karl told Wilhelm what he had seen. They have so much, he said quietly. Food, equipment, everything. And they don't even realize how fortunate they are. They complain about minor inconveniences while we starve, while our cities burn, while our children die. Wilhelm nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand the full scope of the deception. Germany had been told the Allies were weak, were collapsing, were barely holding on, but the reality was inverted. The Allies had such overwhelming material superiority that they could afford to treat prisoners generously, follow international law, maintain moral high ground, while simultaneously crushing Germany through sheer industrial might. The cognitive dissonance was excruciating. Everything inverted, everything backwards. The monsters were not the enemies. The monsters were the system that had lied so thoroughly that grown men could not recognize reality when they lived inside it. As weeks turned to months, the evidence accumulated. Medical care when prisoners fell ill. Real surgery with real medicine when a man developed appendicitis. Educational classes teaching English mathematics, Canadian history. A camp newspaper written by prisoners in German. Sports tournaments between barracks. A band that played music on instruments provided by the camp. This was not a death camp. This was a prisoner of war facility operating according to international law. And every day of humane treatment was another nail in the coffin of Nazi propaganda. But not all prisoners accepted the evidence. The camp divided into factions, hardcore believers who insisted everything was a trick, psychological warfare, that the real cruelty would come later. These men, mostly SS officers and true believers, isolated themselves in certain barracks, refused to attend classes, refused to acknowledge reality, clung to ideology with desperate strength because admitting they were wrong meant admitting everything was wrong. Other prisoners, mostly young soldiers who had never deeply believed, simply adapted, accepted that life as a prisoner was better than life in combat, learned English, worked their jobs, played soccer, made the best of circumstances they could not control. Then there were men like Wilhelm, men whose entire worldview was being systematically demolished, who read every newspaper, who asked every question, who attended every class, who were trying to rebuild understanding from the ground up, starting with the acknowledgement that they had been deceived about fundamental things. And there were silent ones like Karl, who did not argue or debate, who just watched and listened and quietly became different people, who let reality reshape them without resistance because resistance was futile against accumulated evidence. In October, tensions exploded. An SS officer named Oberfuhrer Koch was holding court in Barracks 3. surrounded by loyalists, preaching about German superiority, about how the comfortable conditions were just brainwashing, how true Germans would resist, how faith in the Führer would be rewarded when Germany achieved final victory. Wilhelm had been reading in his bunk, trying to ignore Koch, but finally could not stay silent. He set down his newspaper and spoke calmly. Herr Koch, we have been here 7 months. Not one prisoner has been tortured. Not one. We eat better than German civilians. We receive medical care. We are treated according to international law. At what point do you accept that perhaps we were lied to? Koch's face flushed red. You were always weak, Bauer, a teacher, an intellectual. You never understood what we were building. I understood perfectly, Wilhelm replied. That is the problem. I taught those lies to children. I believed them myself. And now I see the truth. Everything was built on deception. Everything. Other prisoners gathered to watch. The confrontation had been building for months. Martin pushed through the crowd and stood beside Wilhelm. I have worked in their motor pools, Martin said loudly. I have seen their equipment. The propaganda told us the Allies were weak, but I have seen with my own eyes that they have more of everything than Germany could ever produce. We were never going to win this war. Koch spat on the floor. Defeatist, traitor. No, Martin shot back. Realist. I can see what is in front of my face instead of clinging to lies, because the truth is too painful. Karl, who rarely spoke in arguments, slowly stood from his bunk. The room went quiet. Everyone knew Karl almost never spoke unless he had something important to say. I am a farmer, Karl said softly. I know land. I know what it takes to feed people. Every week I work on Canadian farms, and I see the truth. Germany cannot win because Germany cannot feed its own population. We invaded Poland for living space. We invaded Russia for grain. But these Canadians have more food than they can eat. They export food while German children starve. The mathematics of this war never favored us, never could have favored us. We were doomed from the beginning. Silence. Koch looked around and saw that he was losing, that most men were nodding at Karl's words. He stormed out of the barracks, his small group of loyalists following. But the confrontation had forced a reckoning. Prisoners had to choose. Believe the evidence or believe the ideology. Trust their own observations or trust the propaganda they had been fed. Accept uncomfortable truth or cling to comfortable lies. Most chose truth, not because they wanted to, but because reality was too persistent, too overwhelming, too undeniable. In late October, Canada celebrated Thanksgiving. The camp announced a special holiday meal. Wilhelm, Martin, and Karl looked at each other with knowing eyes. They had been here long enough to understand this would not be an execution. But nothing prepared them for what came. The mess hall was decorated, Canadian flags, some German decorations made in the camp workshop, tables arranged more like a restaurant than a military dining facility. Guards excited, smiling, treating this like a real celebration. When prisoners filed in, they could smell food cooking. Rich, warm, delicious. They lined up with metal trays, uncertain what to expect. The food that emerged from the kitchen was extraordinary. Roasted turkey, real turkey whole birds cooked perfectly, stuffing with bread and herbs, mashed potatoes with gravy, cranberry sauce, fresh vegetables, fresh bread still warm, and for dessert, pumpkin pie. The servers put huge portions on each tray, more food than Wilhelm had seen on one plate since before the war, enough to feed a German family for 2 days. Martin stared at his tray as hands began shaking again, but this time not from fear, from something else, something more complicated. They are feeding us better than my own family, he whispered. My mother writes letters about bread lines, about hunger, and we are eating turkey. His voice cracked. Tears filled his eyes. The injustice of it, the perverse wrongness, that prisoners ate feasts while civilians starved, that enemies showed generosity while the fatherland demanded sacrifice without return. Karl took a bite of turkey, tender, perfectly seasoned. Tears ran down his weathered face, but he made no sound, just cried silently while he chewed. I have not tasted real meat like this since before the war, he finally managed. Not horse meat, not synthetic protein. This is real meat from a real animal raised for food. Wilhelm sat very still. Around him, 843 German prisoners were eating a feast. At their own tables, Canadian guards ate the same meal, laughing, talking, not celebrating Germany's defeat, just celebrating a harvest holiday where people gave thanks for abundance. And Wilhelm understood with devastating clarity. The guards were not treating this as special. To them, this was just a normal holiday meal. They had so much abundance that feeding prisoners generously was unremarkable, was just what you did because you could, because you had resources and laws required fair treatment and moral codes suggested generosity even toward enemies. The full weight crashed down on Wilhelm. They do not hate us, he said aloud, though speaking to himself. They never hated us. We were told they were monsters. But they are just people, young men doing jobs, following rules, treating us the way they would want to be treated if they were prisoners. A young Canadian guard named Morrison walked past. Wilhelm called to him in careful English. "Excuse me, may I ask why you treat us this way?" "We are enemies. We tried to kill your friends." Morrison looked genuinely confused, like Wilhelm had asked why the sky was blue. He thought for a moment. "Well, sir, you're prisoners of war. You're not fighting anymore. You're just men far from home. You followed orders same as we follow orders. Geneva Convention says we treat you fairly. That is what we do. Plus it is Thanksgiving. Everyone should have a good meal on Thanksgiving, do you not think?" He smiled like he had explained something obvious, then walked away to continue serving. Wilhelm set down his fork, appetite gone, replaced by nausea. "Do you understand what this means?" he said urgently to Martin and Carl in German. "Everything we were told was lies. Churchill is not a monster. The Allies are not savages. The Geneva Convention is not propaganda. It is real law they actually follow. They treat prisoners with respect because their rules say to, not because we deserve it, just because it is right." Martin was nodding, face pale. The newsreels back home, the speeches, the promises that we were the master race, that we would win because we were superior. All lies. All lies, Carl whispered. The three men sat in silence while around them hundreds ate and some laughed, and someone at another table was saying this was the best meal he had eaten in 5 years. The sound of forks on metal trays filled the room. The smell of turkey and gravy and fresh bread. The evidence too overwhelming to dismiss. Wilhelm thought about the children he had taught, about filling their heads with Nazi ideology, while believing every word himself, about his own children growing up in a Germany built on these lies, and he felt something break inside him. Not collapse, just break and begin reforming into something different. The weeks after Thanksgiving were difficult, not because of conditions, because of psychological reckoning, because everything these men thought they knew was being systematically proven false. Letters home showed the transformation. Wilhelm wrote to his wife Greta in careful words that censors would allow. "I am well. The camp is clean. I have enough food. I am treated fairly. This war is strange, Greta. Nothing is as we were told." He did not know how to explain that enemies treated him better than his own government ever had. Did not have words for that betrayal. Martin wrote to his mother, "Mama, please do not worry. I have enough to eat. More than enough. I am warm and safe. The Canadians are not monsters like we were told. I do not understand anything anymore." Christmas brought another moment of reckoning. The camp organized a celebration. Decorated tree, carols, another feast. Most prisoners participated happily, but the hardcore believers boycotted it, held their own somber gathering in Barracks 3 with no decorations and no joy. Just ideology clinging to itself in the face of overwhelming, contradicting evidence. Wilhelm attended the main celebration. A choir of prisoners and guards sang Silent Night in German and English. The camp chaplain gave a speech about peace and forgiveness. Afterward, Morrison approached Wilhelm carrying a small package. "My mother sent me a care package from home, sir," Morrison said, "but I thought you might like to have some of it." Wilhelm opened the package. Homemade cookies, chocolates, a hand-knit scarf. "I cannot accept this," Wilhelm said. "This is from your mother. You should keep it." "Sir, it is Christmas," Morrison replied. "My mom would want me to share. She is a religious woman. She believes we are all God's children, even if we wear different uniforms." Wilhelm took the package with shaking hands. "Thank you. Your mother raised a very good son." That night, Wilhelm lay in his bunk, holding the scarf, and he finally understood completely. The propaganda had not just lied about the enemy, it had taught him to hate, to see other people as less than human, to view the world as combat where only the strongest survived. But Morrison's mother sent gifts to an enemy prisoner at Christmas. Guards played soccer with prisoners like friends. The camp doctor saved German lives with the same care given to Canadians. These were not actions of inferior people. These were actions of people raised with better values. Values about human dignity, about following rules, about treating everyone with basic respect regardless of nationality or uniform. Values that were built on truth instead of lies. May 8, 1945. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Nazi government had collapsed. The loudspeakers at Camp 30 crackled with the announcement, VE Day, victory in Europe. In the guard stations, Canadian soldiers cheered and celebrated. In the barracks, reactions were complex and varied. Some prisoners cried, some sat in stunned silence. A few hardcore believers still insisted it was propaganda that Germany would rise again. But most knew the truth. The war was lost. Everything was lost. And they would have to return to a Germany that no longer existed. Wilhelm stood in the recreation yard looking at the Canadian flag moving in spring wind. He had been a prisoner for over 2 years. In that time, he had become a completely different person than the man who had surrendered in North Africa. That man had believed in German superiority, had faith in the Führer's vision, had certainty that he was fighting for something righteous. This man had none of those beliefs, had only the knowledge that he had been deceived, that everything he fought for was based on lies, that the enemy had been more honorable than the cause he served. Martin came and stood beside him. "What do you think is left?" Martin asked quietly. "Of Germany, I mean. What is still standing?" Wilhelm shook his head. "I think very little. The newsreels we have seen show cities in ruins. The reports say millions homeless. I suspect we are returning to a Germany that does not exist anymore." The guards told them repatriation would not happen immediately. Germany was in chaos. Allied armies occupied different zones. Transportation was limited. Food was scarce everywhere. Some prisoners actually asked if they could stay at Camp 30 longer. The camp was cleaner, safer, better fed than whatever waited in Germany. Karl was among those who asked to stay. He told Wilhelm, "I have no home to return to. East Prussia is under Soviet control now. My farm, my village, everything is gone. My family is scattered or dead. Why should I rush back to starvation and ruins?" During those final months of waiting, the camp authorities organized special classes about Germany's future, about the Marshall Plan, where America would help rebuild Europe, about democratic government replacing Nazi rule, about the Nuremberg trials where leaders would face justice for war crimes. Wilhelm attended every class, took notes, asked questions until instructors grew tired of answering. He was trying to understand, trying to prepare himself, trying to learn how to live in a world where everything he thought he knew had been proven false. One instructor was Major Campbell, a Canadian officer who had studied in Germany before the war and spoke perfect German. He became a mentor to Wilhelm. One day, Campbell pulled Wilhelm aside after class. "What you will see when you return will be shocking," Campbell said gently. "The cities are rubble, economy collapsed, millions displaced. Your people will be angry and hurt and desperate. Some will still believe Nazi propaganda. Others will reject everything German, even language and culture. You will have to navigate that carefully." "What should I do?" Wilhelm asked. Campbell thought carefully. "Tell the truth as much as you safely can. Help rebuild Germany honestly this time. Do not let the lies take root again. That is the most important thing. Do not let the next generation grow up believing the same falsehoods." Wilhelm carried those words with him. September 19th, 1945. Wilhelm, Martin, and Karl were assigned to the same transport ship. Perhaps random chance. Perhaps guards had noticed they were friends and kept them together deliberately. The ship was crowded and uncomfortable. Nothing like the transport that brought them to Canada. But no one complained. They were going home. Saying goodbye to Canadian guards was unexpectedly difficult. Corporal Morrison, promoted from private, shook Wilhelm's hand firmly. "Good luck over there, sir. I hope you find your family safe." Thank you, Corporal, Wilhelm said, for everything, for treating us like human beings when you did not have to. You taught me more than you will ever know. The ship crossing took 8 days. Wilhelm stood at the railing, watching Canada disappear. Martin beside him said, I learned more in 2 years as a prisoner than in 4 years as a soldier. We were taught to hate these people, to fear them, to see them as enemies. But they treated us better than our own government ever did. Carl nodded. We were taught to hate, but they taught us something different through their actions. Not through words, through how they actually behaved. And I will never forget that. Wilhelm was quiet. But later he wrote in the journal he had been keeping. September 19th, 1945. At sea, returning to Germany, I am bringing back more than I left with. Not possessions because I have almost nothing, but knowledge, understanding, the terrible weight of knowing how deeply we were deceived and how easily we believed. I do not know what awaits us, but I know I must tell the truth. However hard, however dangerous, the truth is all we have left now. The ship docked at Bremerhaven in late September. The port was destroyed, cranes twisted like broken toys, buildings burned out shells, harbor filled with sunken ships. This was Germany. This was home. This was what remained. As prisoners walked off the ship, they saw German civilians for the first time in years. The shock was physical. Thin children with huge eyes begging for food. Women in rags digging through rubble for anything useful. Old men sitting on broken walls with blank stares. Everyone looked beaten, starved, lost. Martin turned to Wilhelm, face white. My God, what have we done? What did we do to our own country? Carl was crying openly. This is Germany. This is what we fought for. This is what all those people died for. They were processed through a refugee center. The word felt strange. German soldiers, now refugees in their own homeland. They received identity papers, ration cards that were almost worthless, addresses of organizations that might help locate families. Wilhelm learned that Cologne was 60% destroyed. His old school had burned. There was no information yet about whether his family had survived. Martin heard that Essen was in similar condition. Karl's village in East Prussia was behind Soviet lines. Impossible to reach. Everything he had known was simply gone. Wilhelm spent 3 months in a displaced persons camp, searching desperately for information about his family. Living on thin rations in a cold building that was far worse than his barracks at Camp 30. Standing in long lines daily asking officials if they had any records. Every day, the same answer. No information yet. Keep checking. Then in December, a miracle. Someone found his family. His wife Greta was alive, living with their 2 children in a single room in what remained of their old neighborhood. When Wilhelm finally saw them, he cried so hard he could not speak. Greta had lost 30 pounds, looked 10 years older. Their daughter was 13 now, but looked 10 small and thin from years of insufficient food. Their son was missing, had been conscripted in the final desperate weeks. Nobody knew if he was alive or dead or in prison somewhere. That first night, Greta made what she called dinner, mostly water with a few vegetable pieces floating in it. Wilhelm forced himself to eat without showing how thin and terrible it was. Then he gave them food from a Red Cross package. Chocolate, canned meat, hard biscuits. Greta and the children attacked it like starving animals, which is what they were. Greta looked up, tears streaming. How do you have this food? The Canadians gave it to us, Wilhelm said softly, to bring home. Greta looked confused. The Canadians, but we were told they were savages, that they tortured prisoners. Wilhelm closed his eyes. No, Greta, that was a lie. Everything was a lie. And then he told her about the boiled potatoes, about the camp with heat and running water, about Morrison and his mother's Christmas cookies, about learning that everything they believed was built on hatred and falsehoods. Wilhelm could not return to teaching immediately. Allied occupation forces checked everyone who had been in the Nazi Party. Wilhelm had been forced to join to keep his teaching job like most teachers. He had to wait for clearance. So he worked clearing rubble, manual labor that left his hands bleeding and back aching. But he did it without complaint. This was penance. This was what rebuilding required. In 1947, the authorities finally cleared Wilhelm to teach again. He returned to a classroom. But he was completely different from the teacher he had been before the war. Instead of lecturing and demanding memorization, he asked questions, made students think, encouraged them to question everything, even him. When he taught history, he did not hide Germany's crimes. He told students about Camp 30, about the boiled potatoes they had feared would be their last meal. You must never accept propaganda without questioning, he told them. Always ask who benefits from this message. What am I not being told? And most important are my so-called enemies. Really, enemies are just human beings. I have been taught to hate. In 1952, Wilhelm received a letter from Canada, from Robert Morrison, now a civilian working as an engineer in Toronto. He had tracked Wilhelm down through Red Cross records. The letter said if Wilhelm ever wanted to move to Canada, Morrison would sponsor him. Wilhelm kept that letter until he died, but never accepted the offer. He told Greta, "Germany needs people who understand what we did wrong. If everyone who learned the truth leaves, what hope does this country have?" Martin returned to Essen and found his mother alive, but his father dead in the firebombing. Martin's mechanical skills were desperately needed. He worked first for British occupation forces, then later for German companies rebuilding. In 1949, Martin joined the new trade union movement. Workers' rights, fair wages, safe working conditions, the right to negotiate with employers, all things he had learned about in Canada. "I saw how workers were treated there," he told fellow union members, "with dignity and respect, with real rights. We can build that here too." By 1955, Martin was a union leader fighting for better treatment. His union friends did not know about Camp 30. He rarely talked about it, but it shaped everything he did. Karl never found his wife or son. Both died fleeing Soviet forces. His daughter survived and was living in West Berlin. In 1956, Karl finally met his daughter again. She was 32, married with children, barely remembered him. But Karl became a devoted grandfather, told his grandchildren stories about the war, not about battles, about a camp in Canada where he learned the world was bigger and kinder than he had been taught. In 1973, a German filmmaker making a documentary about POW camps found Wilhelm Martin and Karl through veterans organizations. All three were still alive. First time they had seen each other in 28 years. They met in Cologne, embraced, cried, laughed. The filmmaker asked them to reflect on their experiences. Wilhelm, now 64 with gray hair, spoke first. "I lost years of my life to a lie. I taught lies to innocent children. I fought for lies. And I only learned the truth because I became a prisoner. How insane is that I was more free as a prisoner in Canada than I ever was as a free man in Nazi Germany. The boiled potatoes we thought meant execution were actually the beginning of my real education." My message to young people: question everything, especially things that make you feel special or superior. The most dangerous lies are the ones that flatter you. Martin leaned forward. "I was just a working-class kid from Essen. Not educated like Wilhelm, but even I could see the truth once I opened my eyes. We were told the Allies were weak. I saw their abundance. We were told they were cruel. They treated us with dignity. And coming home, seeing what Germany became, the Canadians could have destroyed us completely. They had the power. Instead, they helped us rebuild. Why? Because they were not monsters. They were people with a better system, a more honest system." Karl spoke last. "I lost everything, my home, my family, my farm. But in that Canadian camp, I found something. Not happiness. You cannot be happy as a prisoner, but humanity. I saw that even enemies can treat each other with respect. The boiled potatoes we thought were our last meal were actually our first real meal in months. I am an old man now. I will never see my farm again. But I have grandchildren, and I tell them, never let anyone teach you to hate. Never believe you are better than others because of where you were born. And always treat people the way those Canadians treated us, even though we were their enemies." Wilhelm died in 1989, just weeks before the Berlin Wall fell. His last words to his wife were about Camp 30. "I wish I could have thanked them properly. All of them." Martin lived until 2003. He attended reunions with Canadian veterans, emotional gatherings where former prisoners and guards shared meals and memories and forgiveness. Karl died in 1995 in Bavaria, surrounded by grandchildren. On his bedside table was a yellowed photograph of 3 German soldiers standing in front of a barracks at Camp 30 in April 1943. They looked scared and confused. but they were alive. The lesson endures. That propaganda is most powerful when it makes you believe you are right and good. That cruelty becomes easy when you stop seeing others as human. That real courage sometimes means admitting you were completely wrong. But also that even in darkest times, some people choose decency. That rules and laws matter. That treating others with dignity and respect, even enemies, might be the most powerful thing you can do. 3 German soldiers thought boiled potatoes meant death. Instead, those simple potatoes became the first step in a journey back to being human. And maybe that is the real lesson. We are all just people, fed by the same earth, eating the same food, capable of terrible cruelty, yes, but also capable of unexpected kindness. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against lies is simply showing people the truth. The boiled potatoes were not a death meal. They were just food. Simple, nourishing, ordinary. But they became a symbol of the moment when 3 men began to understand that everything they believed was false, that the monsters were not the enemies they faced, but the system that had taught them to hate. This is what Camp 30 proved, that humanity is stronger than propaganda. That truth eventually overcomes lies. That 3 meals a day and fair treatment and basic human decency can do more to change hearts than any ideology ever could. The potatoes were just potatoes, but they changed everything.